Abram, I will make you into a great nation. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you.
Remember Monsters, Inc.? I mean, back when Pixar was in its heyday with Sully and Boo and, of course, Mike Wazowski. Well, my family loved it, and my kids, they were the perfect age for this movie. And one of their favorite scenes was the big restaurant scene where these huge, scary monsters are terrified of this tiny little girl who caught on and started yelling, "Boo!" as the monsters ran chaotically, terrified in every direction. Well, that's what makes Monsters, Inc. funny. It's because you have these huge, scary monsters who don't recognize that they're not in danger. They're not supposed to be afraid of a tiny, harmless girl. Actually, an entire civilization of monsters has learned to live by lies, and they've forgotten who they are. Ultimately, they're living out of their fear rather than who they are called to be. Well, it's not unlike followers of God, where we can act just like foolish monsters running from a little girl when we become overwhelmed by fear rather than trusting in who we are in Christ. Well, in this study, we're going to look at a man who wrestled between living out of fear and living out of who God called him to be. And what we'll learn from his example is that when we live out of our calling, we find rest and life. However, when we live out of our fear, we're going to find trouble. So if we're going to follow the Lord and really learn to live by His truth and have life to the fullest, we need to live out of our calling, not out of our fear. So last time we looked at the Tower of Babel and Nimrod, whose name means rebel, and how God used man's rebellion to cause humans to spread out and begin to fill the earth. Well, now we're in the time after the tower, and with spreading humanity across the globe with various languages, well, what happens is Genesis narrows back down onto genealogy of the descendants of Noah's son Shem. It's going to be similar to when we looked at Genesis chapter 10 in the Table of Nations, only this time we're going to focus on the descendants of Shem, or who are called the Semites or Shemites. Well, check it out. Chapter 11, verse 10. 2 years after the flood, when Shem was 100 years old, he became the father of Arphaxad. And after he became the father of Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and had other sons and daughters. And this is what Genesis is doing. It began with Adam and Eve and all their descendants, all of humanity. And it's beginning to narrow down onto these descendants, these specific family group. And it narrows down onto this one family, and we're going to follow this one family all the way through the Old Testament to one tribe, narrowing down to one king and his descendants, all the way down to one child born in a stable in Bethlehem. And that narrowing process, it continues and solidifies here in chapter 11 with names that we already read back in chapter 10, but with more details, names like Eber in verse 14 and his son Peleg in verse 15, who we learned back in chapter 10 was the one who walked away from the Tower of Babel speaking Hebrew. In fact, that language was named after Eber, which was his father, which is why the Jewish people are called Ebers or Hebrews. Well, let's pick up the genealogy back in verse 24. When Nahor lived 29 years, notice that the lifespans are getting shorter and shorter. He, that's Nahor, became the father of Terah. And after he became the father of Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and had other sons and daughters. After Terah had lived 70 years, he became the father of Abram. Nahor, and Haran. And we come to Terah's son, Abram, who the Bible is going to focus on for the next 15 chapters, and that he is the patriarch, Abraham, the father of the Jewish people. So you can see how the Bible keeps narrowing down onto this family, tracing its lineage all the way down to Jesus. Well, verse 27, this is the account of Terah's family line. Terah became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran became the father of Lot. While his father Terah was still alive, Haran died in Ur of the Chaldeans, in the land of his birth. Well, a couple things to notice here. First, there's been extensive archaeological finds at Ur, which is modern-day Iraq. And here's some photos of jewelry and idols that they worshipped in Ur that I took at the British Museum that are actually from the time of Abram. So this is what Abram grew up with. These are the types of gods and false idols that his family followed that he knew growing up. And we learn from Joshua that Terah and Haran and Nahor, they didn't worship I Am. They didn't worship the one true God, but they worshiped the false gods of Ur. Look at this from Joshua chapter 24. Joshua said to all the people, "This is what I am." Again, when we see the word Lord capitalized in our English Bibles, it's the covenant name of God, Yahweh, or in English, I Am. "This is what I am, the God of Israel says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshiped other gods." Now, this is really important to grasp and understand, because Abram, he didn't grow up in a home that knew God. And some of you can relate to that. And that's the context of the life of Abram. And make no mistake, this is a part of the world where culture was founded by Nimrod, the rebel. So literally, Abram grew up in a society founded in rebellion against God. Can any of us relate to that? Well, second thing to notice here is that in these few verses, we've jumped a couple hundred years from right after the flood in the first half of chapter 11 in the Tower of Babel through these genealogies to around 2000 BC. And if we put up this chart, you can see the lifespans are getting shorter, and we don't know exactly why, but it's reasonable from what Scripture says to assume that that's the consequences and the effects of the fall, that sin and death are being revealed in shorter lifespans, more corruption, disease, and sin and genetic mutations. As we do the math and count the years and the lifespans, it appears that so far in the book of Genesis, we've actually covered about 2,000 years from creation to Abram being born in around 2000 BC. That means we're studying the time about 2,000 years before Jesus is born. And now today, in 2025, we're living about 2,000 years after Jesus died and rose again. So according to the biblical timeline, it's about 6,000 years of human history. Well, verse 29, Abram and Nahor both married. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah. She was the daughter of Haran and the father of both Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was childless because she was not able to conceive. And right away, from the moment we're introduced to Sarai and Abram, we discover that if Abram's bloodline would be passed through Sarai, it would take a miracle. Now, this is a repeating theme throughout the rest of the Bible. It's almost like God's signature in this family line, that throughout the bloodline of the Messiah, we find women that can't have babies. Why? Because this bloodline is miraculous. Miracle birth after miracle birth, culminating in the final miracle birth, a baby born in a stable to a woman who was a virgin. I mean, the ultimate miracle birth. Well, it all starts right here with Abram and Sarai, a woman who cannot have children. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, the wife of his son Abram, and together they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. Terah lived 205 years, and then he died in Haran. Now, we don't know why Terah decided to move his family. Maybe it was because of the sadness from his son dying. We don't know, because the Bible doesn't say so. But we do know that in God's sovereignty, he allowed it to happen. That God put it on Abram's father's heart, who, remember, was not a follower of God, to move to Canaan. But they never made it. They left Ur in the lands of Babylonia and the society founded by Nimrod, this rebel against God, but they stopped in Haran. Notice Haran? It's named after Terah's son who died, who had a son named Lot. Now, Lot, he's important because he becomes like an adopted son of Abram, and that Abram takes Lot in after his father died. Well, chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." So for his entire life, and we're going to discover in a moment that he was 75 years old at this time, Abram had followed his father's family, the religion of Ur and its people. It was the life he knew. It was comfortable. It was certain. Then God speaks. No longer was he to live in his father's household. God was calling him to a new home, a new life, where God would bring about all of his calling on Abram's life. And I just want to pause for a moment to deal with the idea of a calling. And we talk about callings and God's calling upon our lives, but what is a calling? Well, simply put, a calling is our mission, our purpose, what God has purposed us to become and accomplish for him and by his power. And it seems the way God worked in Abram's life and in our lives today is often very much the same. When God calls us, he calls us out of what is comfortable to what is uncomfortable, from what we know to what we don't know, even from what is safe to what is potentially dangerous. Because this is the beginning of an important principle that we're going to see throughout our verse-by-verse study through the whole Bible, that God's highest priority, it's not our comfort or our safety or even our happiness. His priority is to make us more like Jesus, which is why he takes us from what we like, what we know, what we're comfortable with, to what we don't know, to what is uncomfortable, so that we, in that moment, become dependent upon his voice alone, because we have nothing in ourselves that we can rely upon, which is why it's so important to live out of our calling, not out of our fears. And again, it's critical to grasp the weight of God's calling upon Abram. To remember, Abram didn't grow up in a home that followed the one true God. Remember what Joshua told us about Terah and the family that God called Abram to leave? Joshua said to all the people, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Long ago, your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham, and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. But I took your father Abraham from the land beyond the Euphrates and led him throughout Canaan and gave him many descendants." Terah and his family, they worshipped false gods. But in the midst of this idol-worshiping home, God's voice broke through to choose Abram, to choose him to build his nation. God reached out and grabbed Abram's heart and began a relationship with him. That may be you. And you may come from a family who doesn't worship God. Well, you may have noticed in the new title package at the beginning of this video that we're calling this section of Genesis Uprising. We saw an uprising of rebellion against God last week at the Tower of Babel. Well, now we see a different kind of uprising, an uprising of a man's heart, raising above his life's darkness around him to follow the voice of the one true God. Well, chapter 12, verse 2, I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So God's voice is piercing through the darkness to grab his heart. God's calling Abram to a new land where he promised to, 1, make him a great nation, 2, make his name great, 3, empower him, and 4, that all people on earth would be blessed through him. Now we know that each of these 4 promises have come true. He is the father of not just a great nation, but several nations. Abram's name, it's still great. It still packs authority even to this day. God empowered Abraham and worked throughout his life, through the rest of his life. And most importantly, all people, every person who has ever lived since, even every person living on the planet up to this very day, has been blessed through Abraham's descendant. Well, how did that come true? Through Abraham's most important descendant, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, who came and died to save humanity from the consequences of sin. First, began in the garden with Adam and Eve. Everything we read and hear about Abram and the promises God gave him, they were all about that, about reversing the curse of sin and saving humanity from eternal death. But in this moment, 2,000 years before Jesus was even born, Abram couldn't see all of that. And these promises, they sounded great, but there was one huge problem with everything he was hearing. And we find out that problem in the very next verse. So Abram went as the Lord had told him. So he left his father's home in Haran and left, and Lot went with him. But here's the huge problem. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. This brings up 2 issues. First of all these promises from God, they were based upon his descendants. One big problem. He and his wife were infertile. How could he become the father of a great nation through whom the whole world would be blessed if he and his wife could not conceive? And second big issue, it's not as obvious until you think about it. Do 75-year-olds like change? Okay, around our church on the hill, there's been a ton of changes over the past year, and that's only going to increase this year as we start to, you might notice new paint, new lights, new service times, a lot of new faces. Now, we're not just going to be making changes for change's sake. We're trying to respond to what the Holy Spirit is leading us to do in order to reach this community. But let me tell you from firsthand experience, 75-year-olds do not like change unless it's God leading in order to accomplish his calling upon a life or upon a church. Well, Abram, he could have remained in Haran with his family, all he had known for 75 years. It would have been safe. It would have been comfortable. But he had to choose between what was comfortable, safe, and easy, or to follow God's will, which means that for Abram to stay in Haran, he would have been in direct disobedience to God, not unlike Nimrod, and the refusal of the people at the Tower of Babel after the ark to separate and fill the earth as God had commanded them. That's why even 75-year-olds need to follow Abram's example to live out of their callings, and not out of their fears. Same thing with Church on the Hill. We can stay with what's comfortable, with what's safe, with what's familiar. But I believe this would be disobedient to the calling I know God has placed on my life and what I believe God is calling this church to. Let's live out of our calling, not out of our fear. Verse 5, he took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the peoples they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. So Abram heard the call of God and obeyed. Simply put, he was living out of his calling instead of out of fear. He followed God's voice to the land of Canaan, which we know as today as the promised land, modern day Israel, the most hotly contested piece of real estate on the planet to this very day. The reasons all traced back to what we're studying over the next few weeks here in Genesis. But I want you to notice throughout this study is that this promise God gave to Abram, it was unfulfilled in his lifetime on earth. Throughout Abram's life, we never see this promise of being a great nation come to fruition. In fact, only one time in Abram's life does he ever even own a piece of property in the land that God led him to. The only land he ever owned was just a tomb on somebody else's land that he purchased when his wife died, which leads to another important lesson we're going to learn from Abram's life. Is just because we don't see a calling happening doesn't take away the reality of that promise. That's why we need to live out of our calling and not out of our fear. Verse 6, Abram traveled throughout the land as far as the site of the great tree of Morah at Shechem. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built an altar there to the Lord who had appeared to him. Abram lived out of his calling into the land that God had promised. This had to be an intimidating experience. I mean, the land God was showing him was a land controlled by another people, the Canaanites, and we're going to learn all about them. Who, if you remember, they were actually cursed by God specifically because of the sin of their father Ham that he committed against his father Noah. And I guarantee you, they didn't like Shemites, the descendants of Noah's other son Shem. Yet Abram was resting on who God was calling him to be. Because if you're secure in who God is, and you know what he's calling you to, then you have nothing to fear. Verse 8, from there he went on towards the hills east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. There he built an altar to the Lord and called on the name of the Lord. So up to this point, it's been God calling Abram. Well, this is the first time we see Abram respond by calling upon God in worship. God had called Abraham to this land full of people oblivious to the one true God who had called him. So Abram built an altar, and this is critical to Abram because it was a place to meet personally with the God who called him. It was a place he could offer sacrifice to cover his sins, looking forward to his descendant, the Messiah. It was a place to show submission to God and to worship God. A place that, regardless of how difficult life became or the trials he faced, he'd have a place to intentionally meet with God and to refocus on the calling God had placed on his life rather than upon the dangers around him. He lived by his calling, not by his fear.